car is silent. Not the comfortable kind of silence, the kind two people build over years of understanding each other's rhythms. This silence is different. It has edges. It presses against the windows and fills the space between them like something neither one is ready to name. Meghan sits with her hands folded in her lap, watching the California hills move past in the early afternoon light. Harry is beside her, close enough to touch, but somewhere behind his eyes, he is somewhere else entirely. Somewhere cold and institutional and far away, replaying the morning's news the way people replay accidents, searching for the moment they could have turned the wheel differently. The ruling had landed without ceremony. No warning, no softening language, just a decision, handed down through formal channels, stripping away one more layer of the life Harry had believed he could still partially reclaim. Another door, closing quietly. Meghan doesn't say anything for a long moment. She notices something, though. Something she files away carefully, the way she has learned to file things. Not with panic, not with grief, but with the particular alertness of a woman who has spent years reading rooms that weren't always honest with her. Her phone, resting face up on the seat beside her, has not buzzed once since the news broke. Not once. 3 months ago, that same phone would have been alive with messages. People checking in, people offering words, people wanting to be adjacent to whatever was happening. Now there is only the sound of the road, and Harry's breathing, and the soft weight of an absence neither of them is quite ready to discuss out loud. She glances at him. He is still looking forward. Still hoping in the way he has always hoped, with his whole chest, with a kind of stubborn warmth that she has loved and feared in equal measure. Meghan says nothing, but what she overhears just days later will completely change the way she views everyone around them. Sometimes rejection doesn't arrive loudly. It doesn't come with a press release or a dramatic confrontation. It comes like weather, a slow, almost imperceptible drop in temperature that you only notice when you realize you've been cold for a while without registering it. Harry's latest legal and security setback hits the press in the way these things always do. Clinical language, official statements, the careful institutional vocabulary that makes devastating decisions sound like administrative procedures. The British government's position on his security arrangements, already a bruise that has never fully healed, has once again hardened into something final sounding. Not a door slamming, a lock turning, slowly, quietly. Harry, characteristically, tries to hold the line. Those close to the couple describe him in the days following as deliberately upbeat. Making plans, focusing on upcoming projects, deflecting the weight of the news with the kind of optimism that is either deeply genuine or deeply necessary. Perhaps both. He speaks in private moments about how these things move in cycles, how the narrative always shifts, how time has a way of correcting the record. Meghan watches him say these things. She smiles at the right moments. She nods. She does not disagree out loud. But behind the composure, behind the careful posture she has mastered in spaces that required her to be simultaneously invisible and impeccable, something is shifting in her too, because she is starting to notice the smaller things. A meeting with a media figure that was supposed to happen last month, rescheduled, then quietly not mentioned again. An invitation to a high-profile philanthropic event that arrived later than usual, worded with a formality that felt slightly more distanced than before. A reply from someone she had considered a genuine ally that took 4 days to arrive, and said very little when it finally did. One cancelled meeting turned out not to be accidental at all. Power often withdraws quietly before people notice. That is the part nobody talks about. Not the dramatic exits, not the public statements of distance, but the small, courteous retreats that individually mean nothing and collectively mean everything. Harry still believes things can recover. Meghan is no longer certain what recovery would even look like. Before we go deeper into what this really means, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss a single update as this story continues to unfold. The cruelest rejection is the kind nobody admits is happening. There is no meeting, no conversation, no moment where someone looks you in the eye and says, "Things are different now." Instead, there are delayed replies, invitations that arrive slightly later than they used to, worded with a fraction less warmth. Rooms where the energy shifts when you walk in. Not hostility, not coldness, but something more precise and more painful than either. Careful neutrality. Meghan has always been perceptive in social environments. It is one of the qualities that served her extraordinarily well in the years before Harry, when navigating a Hollywood landscape that rewarded emotional intelligence and punished naivety. She learned early how to read the gap between what people say and what they mean, how to track the invisible architecture of a room. Now that skill is turning inward. She finds herself replaying conversations after they end, analyzing word choices, noting who sought eye contact and who didn't, wondering quietly in the margins of her own thoughts, in a way she would never say out loud, whether certain people actually wanted them there, or whether the invitation had simply been too socially costly to withhold. Hollywood executives who, 18 months ago, were eager to explore creative partnerships are suddenly vague about timelines. Not dismissive, never openly dismissive, just unavailable, busy with other priorities. Getting back to her team soon. People become careful around declining influence in the way they become careful around anything that might complicate their own positioning. Meghan notices every single instance. She does not mention most of them to Harry. This is not dishonesty. It is something closer to protection, the instinct to absorb the sharper edges of a situation before someone you love can feel them fully. She has always done this. It has always cost her more than she admits. Then came the private Los Angeles summit that reportedly left Meghan shaken for days. The details of what was discussed in that room remain private. But those familiar with the atmosphere describe Meghan afterward as unusually quiet. More interior than usual. The kind of quiet that happens not when someone has nothing to say, but when they are processing something that hasn't finished arriving yet. The words were not directed at her. That is the thing about the most disorienting feedback, it rarely arrives directly. It floats in from the margins. It lives in the language of industry conversations that are about trend and market and audience behavior, and only incidentally, almost accidentally, about real people with real lives attached to the decisions being made. The phrase that keeps surfacing in media industry circles during this period is one that Meghan hears reported back to her through careful intermediaries. Audience fatigue. Not outrage. Not criticism. Fatigue. And here is where things begin to shift, because there is a meaningful and devastating difference between those two things. Criticism still means attention. Criticism means someone is engaged, provoked, invested enough to respond. Fatigue is something else entirely. Fatigue means the emotional bandwidth people once allocated to caring about your story has quietly been redirected elsewhere. Hollywood rarely announces abandonment. It simply moves on the way water moves, not dramatically, not with declaration, just inevitably, toward the path of least resistance. Harry interprets the noise as a temporary media cycle. He has seen these cycles before. He grew up inside the machinery that generates them. He believes, with the conviction of someone who has watched narratives reverse themselves over decades, that the tide shifts, that patience is a form of strategy, that enduring quietly is its own kind of victory. Meghan hears the same information differently. She does not see a media cycle. She sees a structural repositioning. The difference matters enormously because cycles return to where they started, but structural shifts create new baselines, new normals, new centers of gravity that don't orbit the same points anymore. Public support versus shrinking opportunity. That tension sits between them during this period like a third presence in every conversation. Not spoken, not named, but real in the way that unspoken things are always real, sometimes more real than anything said aloud. But the comment Meghan overhears at a Montecito fundraiser hurts more than any tabloid headline ever could. She is standing near the edge of a beautifully lit room, champagne in hand, smile present and practiced, and from somewhere just behind her right shoulder, carried on a current of warm air and low conversation, comes a cluster of words that finds her like something aimed. She doesn't turn around. She doesn't need to. People can love each other deeply while grieving differently. This is the truth that gets obscured in public narratives about couples under pressure, the assumption that shared circumstances produce shared emotional responses. But grief is not democratic. It does not distribute itself evenly. It finds the fault lines in people and moves through them, and those fault lines are different in every person, shaped by history and memory and the particular way each individual learned to survive the painful parts of being human. Harry grieves with his whole body. Those who have observed him during this period describe a man who is emotionally present to his own pain in a way that is simultaneously admirable and exhausting. Someone who processes loss by talking about it, sitting with it, returning to it, and fighting it the way you fight something you believe you can eventually overcome through sheer force of love. His loyalty is his default setting. He values it above almost everything else. He extends it to institutions and family connections even when the evidence suggests those connections have stopped extending it back. Meghan grieves differently. She watches. She analyzes. She builds internal frameworks for what is happening and what it means and what, if anything, can be done about it. Her processing is strategic not because she is not cold, but because strategy is the container she has learned to put painful things into when the pain itself is too large to hold directly. This is not a flaw. It is the adaptive intelligence of someone who has spent a long time in environments where emotional exposure was a liability. One person was fighting emotionally. The other was adapting strategically. That difference changes relationships slowly. It does not announce itself. It does not create arguments. It creates distance, the particular kind of distance that forms not from conflict but from divergence, when two people are both trying their hardest and still drifting into slightly different emotional time zones. The exhaustion between them during this period is not the exhaustion of people who have stopped caring. It is the exhaustion of people who care enormously and have different, partially incompatible ways of showing it. Different ideas about what forward motion looks like. Different thresholds for what counts as acceptable loss. There are nights in Montecito where the house is quiet and the children are asleep and the two of them are together and still somehow not quite in the same place. And then Meghan hears the word that changes everything. Useful. The room is the kind of room that costs money to look effortless. Warm lighting. Flowers that appear informal but were arranged by someone who charges a significant day rate to make them look that way. Wine glasses so thin they seem to vibrate when you set them down. The particular hum of expensive social ease. Laughter calibrated to carry just far enough. Conversations that appear casual and are anything but. Meghan is near the far side of the room. She has been here an hour. She has been gracious and engaged and has said all the right things in all the right registers. Warm without being familiar. Accessible without being unguarded. This is work. This has always been work. But tonight it costs her more than usual, because she is carrying the accumulated weight of the past several weeks without anywhere to put it down. She is not meant to hear what she hears. It comes from a small cluster of donors standing near a tall floral arrangement. Men and women whose names appear on the boards of foundations and whose presence at events like this one represents a particular kind of ratification. They are not speaking loudly. They are speaking with the comfortable volume of people who are used to their words mattering only in the rooms they choose. The question being posed, as best she can piece together from fragments carried across the space between them, is a simple and devastating one. Whether the Sussexes remain culturally useful. That is the word. Useful. Not inspiring. Not important. Not interesting. Useful, the vocabulary of transaction, applied to a life she has built with her hands and her choices and a cost she is still, in certain ways, still paying. Some wounds happen in silence. She does not move. Her expression does not change in any way that anyone nearby would be able to describe later. This is a skill she acquired a long time ago, the ability to absorb impact without registering it on her face, to keep the external architecture intact while something shifts internally. She finishes her wine. She moves to another part of the room. She finds Harry and touches his arm briefly, and he looks at her and smiles, and she smiles back. Being tolerated is not the same as being valued. That night, Meghan reportedly makes a decision Harry doesn't fully understand yet. If you've made it this far, comment below. Do you think public figures can ever truly escape institutional pressure once they leave powerful systems? Sometimes maturity looks invisible. It does not announce itself with grand gestures or public declarations. It does not arrive with a press release. It moves through a person's daily decisions the way light moves through a room, gradually, almost imperceptibly, until one day the whole quality of the space has changed and you cannot quite identify the moment it happened. In the weeks following the fundraiser, something in Meghan quietly reorganizes. She stops doing something she had been doing almost unconsciously for years, the internal auditing of how others are responding, the constant recalibration to approval signals, the invisible performance of legitimacy for rooms that were never going to simply grant it regardless of how brilliantly she performed. She stops chasing. This is harder than it sounds. The chase is not always obvious from the outside. It doesn't always look like desperation. Sometimes it looks like ambition. Sometimes it looks like strategy. But at its core, it is the same thing, the orientation of one's energy toward a verdict that someone else controls. And Meghan, who has spent significant portions of her adult life seeking ratification from institutions that were not fully built to include her, begins to sense the cost of that orientation with a new and clarifying precision. She encourages Harry, gently and persistently, to release certain things emotionally. She doesn't frame it as giving up. She frames it as redirecting. But the distinction matters mostly to her right now. Harry is not yet in the place where he can hear the difference. There are fewer public responses to criticism during this period. Less visible engagement with the cycles of narrative that, until recently, they had both been caught up in managing. The family becomes the gravitational center. The children, the daily rhythms of a life being rebuilt around something smaller and more real than influence. Walking away emotionally can be harder than fighting. Because fighting at least has forward momentum. It creates the feeling of agency, of engagement, of matching to the outcome. Letting go requires a different kind of courage. The willingness to stop trying to control a verdict that was never entirely yours to influence. Meghan finds that courage slowly, incrementally, in private. But Harry wasn't emotionally ready to let go yet. Not every grief involves death. Sometimes it involves a place, a role, a version of yourself that existed in a specific context and cannot exist in quite the same way outside of it. This is the particular grief that sits at the center of Harry's experience during this period. Not the grief of a man who has lost people, though he has, but the grief of a man who has lost an identity that was always, in some ways, his primary relationship. Harry was born into a system. He was shaped by it at the cellular level, not just in terms of behavior and protocol and public responsibility, but in terms of how he understood himself, what he was for, what his presence in a room meant, the particular quality of weight that came with being who he was, in that family carrying that history. It was a weight that crushed him in certain ways. But it was also undeniably a form of gravity. And when you remove gravity from something that has always organized itself around it, the resulting weightlessness is not always experienced as freedom. It is sometimes experienced as free fall. He speaks in private about legacy, about what he will have meant, about how his children will understand the choices he made and why he made them. These are not the conversations of a man who has made peace with his position. They are the conversations of a man who is still, at some deep and genuine level, waiting for a recognition he has stopped being able to clearly articulate but has not stopped needing. Meghan listens. She holds space for it. But she cannot fix it. This is perhaps the most honest and difficult thing she comes to understand during this period, that the wound Harry carries is not one she created and cannot one she can heal. Predates her. It was written into him before she arrived. And love, as real and sustaining as theirs has been, is not the same thing as the institutional home he lost. It cannot perform that function, however much either of them might wish otherwise. Public sees stability. Private grief deepens. The gap between those two realities grows, not with drama, but with the quiet persistence of water finding its level. Then comes the private dinner where Meghan says something nobody in the room expects. The table seats 12. It is a small gathering by Montecito standards. Executives from the nonprofit sector, a documentary filmmaker, two women whose foundations have quietly moved significant resources through climate and education corridors. The kind of dinner where the real conversations happen in the pauses between the official ones, where the quality of someone's thinking is assessed not in what they announce but in how they respond when something unexpected is introduced. Meghan is not expected to be the most interesting person in the room tonight. She is expected to be gracious, engaged, present in the way that attractive, prominent people are present at these dinners. Pleasantly, decoratively, accessibly. This is the expectation. She has been managing this expectation in rooms like this for most of her adult life. She does not manage it tonight. The conversation turns at some point in the second hour to the question of reinvention, what it means, whether it is possible, whether public identity ever truly transforms or simply rebrands over a new substrate. It is a theoretical conversation, academic in the way these conversations are when no one in the room is supposed to be personally implicated in the answer. Meghan sets down her glass. She says quietly and without particular emphasis, in the tone of someone stating something they have arrived at through considerable private cost, that people waste years trying to convince systems to love them back. The room goes still. Not uncomfortably still. Still in the way rooms go still when something true has been said out loud in a space that didn't quite expect it. One of the women across the table holds her wine glass without drinking from it. The documentary filmmaker looks at Meghan for a moment longer than he intended. That wasn't bitterness. That sounded like acceptance. And that is the thing that surprises everyone present. Not the sentiment itself, which is recognizable and even familiar as a concept, but the tone in which it is delivered. There is no edge in it. No residual performance of grievance. It lands with the particular quality of a statement made by someone who has finished being angry about something and moved into the quieter territory on the other side of anger. But while Meghan was finding that territory, insiders believed Harry was still emotionally standing still. Now is when you see the full shape of it. Take all of it. The silence in the car, the phone that doesn't buzz, the delayed invitations, the careful retreats from people who once moved toward them, the word useful floating across a warm room in Montecito, the dinners that used to happen and quietly stopped, Harry's grief for a home that no longer holds space for him, Meghan's slow and costly excavation of something steadier than approval. Take all of it and lay it end to end. This was never about headlines. Headlines were always the surface. The place where the story was visible enough to be discussed and debated and used as currency in the various transactions that public narrative enables. But the actual story, the one underneath, the one that matters, was always about something more fundamental. About belonging. About whether the systems that shape public life were ever genuinely going to make space for them, or whether the appearance of space was always conditional on a compliance neither of them was ultimately willing to perform. Public attention cannot replace emotional security. This is the realization at the center of this particular chapter of their lives. The visibility was real. The platform was real. The reach was real. But none of it provided the thing that visibility promises and so rarely delivers. The feeling that you are recognized not for your utility to a system but for something intrinsic to who you are. Power teaches people to confuse visibility with belonging. They are not the same thing. They have never been the same thing. But the confusion is so deeply embedded in the architecture of public life that it takes considerable time, and considerable pain, to clearly distinguish between them from the inside. Meghan is beginning to make that distinction with something approaching clarity. Harry is still in the middle of it. And that gap between one person who is learning to release and one person who is still holding on may become the real test of where things go from here. That realization may become the real test of their future together. Subscribe because insiders believe the hardest decisions may still be ahead. There is a version of this story that ends cleanly. Two people, having navigated enormous institutional pressure and the particular cruelties of public life, arrive together at a shared understanding. They choose each other consciously and deliberately, above the systems that neither fully accepted them. They build something new. They find that belonging is not granted by institutions but created in the daily practice of choosing someone. That version exists. It is possible. But it requires something specific from both of them, a willingness to grieve simultaneously, to arrive at release at the same time, to be ready for the next chapter in the same emotional moment. And right now, those two timelines are not fully aligned. Meghan has moved. Not all the way. Not without cost. But she has moved. Toward something quieter and more interior, toward the protection of what is real and present and genuinely hers over the performance of relevance for rooms that were always going to score her on their own terms. There is something in her, in this season, that looks like the beginning of peace. Not the peace of someone who has stopped caring. The peace of someone who has chosen carefully and at significant cost what to care about. Harry is still in the process. He is still carrying the weight of an identity that was assigned to him before he was old enough to evaluate it. still grieving a home that was never entirely safe and is now entirely inaccessible, still looking with the stubbornness of someone who learned love as a synonym for loyalty, for the recognition that the institution he was born into has, repeatedly and clearly, decided not to extend. Not every battle deserves endless fighting. Healing sometimes means releasing systems that never fully accepted you. Love alone cannot erase institutional pain. These are not comfortable truths. They are the truths that arrive late in a difficult season, when everything softer has already been tried. The house in Montecito is quiet tonight. The children are asleep. The evening has the particular stillness that follows long days, the kind of stillness that is either peace arriving or tension resting. It is sometimes impossible to tell the difference from the outside. But insiders close to the couple believe one major decision is still coming. And depending on what Harry chooses next, it could either finally heal the distance between them, or quietly deepen it forever.